Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the True North Report, news that every Canadian needs to know. So, today I'm going to be discussing, pretty much going to be focusing on two main topics and going to touch on a little bit on a third as well. So, the first one that we're going to be discussing happens to do with Remembrance Day, the fact that it's coming up. This episode should be up the day before Remembrance Day on the 10th, might be up on the 11th itself, not sure which yet. But we're going to be discussing a little bit about Remembrance Day, a little about the Canadian involvement in World War I, considering that this will be the 100th year since the ceasefire for the end of the First World War, and we're going to be discussing a little bit about Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister's, what he's done for the veterans, as well as a little bit of our previous Prime Ministers as well. The second story I want to touch up on has to do with Saskatchewan. It appears that Saskatchewan is changing its rules for trespassing laws, but advocacy groups are starting to say that this will target First Nation communities. And this actually has a lot to do with mainly the Colton Boushie case, but also the Peter Kill verdict. They were similar cases that ended up happening, that the verdicts were given earlier this year. So we're going to be focusing on these today, and we're going to touch up a little bit on a third subject, which has to do with the fact that Canada has given money to Tanzania for human rights issues, and since then, Tanzania has gone on an anti-gay purge. And so many people in the government right now are not feeling too good with themselves about that. So let's start off today discussing that the 11th will mark 100 years since we've had the World War I armistice, and that ended up taking place on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It was kind of a significant number, 11-11-11, and it has, since then, it's a date that sticks in the minds of everybody because it was supposed to be the end of the Great War, which has been said to be the war that would end all wars, but this clearly has not been the case. We have been to war many times since then. War has not ended, despite the fact the amount of slaughter that took place. Now, personally, I've always found that World War I history is quite interesting. I don't know what it is specifically, but I think it has to be the type of war they fought, the war in the trenches. I was always really interested in these sort of battles. The fact that people would send thousands of people running across open ground where they're being shot at, where mortars and other artillery are falling all over their position, to attack a fortified position, only to then lose large amounts of numbers. Maybe they take their position, but at the end of the day, it really didn't make much of a difference because a lot of the things that they were fighting for, a lot of these positions, they changed hands so often. It was never really... There was very rarely a decisive victory inside of these battles. Is that the Allies would rush, they would take the German positions, and then the Germans would push back, and they would take back these positions. So the front trenches were constantly changing hands, but it wasn't gaining anything for the people, for these soldiers that were fighting. In fact, when it came to the Battle of the Somme, now the Battle of the Somme was one of the worst battles that ended up taking place during World War I. And what was actually ironic about it was the Battle of the Somme was actually supposed to be a diversion created by the Allies, if I'm remembering correctly. And so the Battle of the Somme took place over a course of several months. It was from July 1st to the 18th of November, 1916. And this ended up being one of the bloodiest times of the war. In fact, 1916 itself was one of the bloodiest times in the entire war. Just last year, actually, Canada ended up celebrating our 100 years since the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which we'll get into as well. And when it came to the Somme was taking place in France by the River Somme. And this ended up being where over 1 million people were wounded and killed, and it was so many lives were lost fighting for this piece of ground that they calculated that every single soldier gained who died ended up gaining no more than an inch or two for their respective territories, both on the British side, or the Allied side, I should say, as well as when it came to the German side. In fact, at the end of the day, it really was more of a victory for the German people. The French, the British, the Canadians, we all suffered great casualties from this battle. But the thing is, too, is that... One second. Let's see if you can see that. Yeah, this is the map of the Battle of the Somme that you're seeing right here. Now, the thing is that made the war so much more difficult for the Allied forces than it did for the Germans was because the Germans, when they first came into this battle, both sides, the German side and the Allied side, was expecting to be a pretty quick war. They were going off. It started at when the war started. It was in summertime. They were expecting the war to be over by Christmas of 1914. That clearly didn't end up being the case. Now, how this ended up happening, that we got into a war of trenches that ended up spanning from one coast all the way to the next, had to do with the fact that the battle was at first, early on in the war, it was a much more fast-paced battle where you're moving over territory. But then when they started to get into the nitty-gritty, they ended up having to bunker down. So they'd start by digging up foxholes and small trenches, very shallow. You know, you'd probably have to lie down in one of these trenches, and they didn't offer a lot of protection. But the problem is that there had been such an advancement when it came to firepower that the troops couldn't actually keep up with it. See, we were still using bolt-action rifles at the time. But what was really significant was the fact that we had artillery and machine guns, which had not really made much of a play on the battlefield before. So you have machine guns which can mow down lines of troops that are running right at you, and you have artillery which can now be fired kilometers away and wreak havoc on enemy lines. So it was necessary to find some sort of protection from it. I mean, you can't exactly run open over a kilometer of ground when you have artillery fire coming down on your heads. It's just not going to work. Now, there was two primary types of artillery. The first one was what was pretty standard you see in a lot of World War I movies, is that the shell would go over the air, and then when it impacted into the ground, that's when it would explode. Now, these were more used during the war for two primary reasons. Destroy enemy armor, such as when the tank started to make its entrance into the battlefield, which was revolutionary, actually. And the second use for it was to bust up enemy trenches. So you would fire it all over the enemy trench and try and destroy as much of their armaments as you could, as much of their defenses as you could, before your troops would rush into battle. So this was the main use of this type of shell. The second one was a type that would explode in midair and would send shrapnel everywhere. So usually a couple meters, 2 or 3 meters before the ground, maybe a little bit higher, these shells would detonate before they impacted the ground. Now, these were primarily used against enemy troops. And the reason for that is because it was much more effective than having a shell that impacted into the ground, where most of the shrapnel would just be stuck in the crater that it formed. So when the troops were advancing over an open battlefield, this is where you brought out the shrapnel shells. Let's see if I can pull up a few images here for you. And then, so that was artillery, and then we had this machine gun here. So we had machine gun nests. And because when you had it in defensive positions such as this, they were just devastating. I mean, who would want to run headfirst into a gun that can shoot hundreds of rounds per minute? And this is exactly what the soldiers did. I think this is primarily what interests me about World War I, was the tactics that were used and how redundant they were, especially when they were coming from the Allied side. The British generals, the British brass, they had fought their battles in one way for so long that they were so used to sending walls of troops against the enemy that when there was need for new tactics in World War I, they just couldn't keep up. In fact, the Germans were much more innovative when it came to these tactics, actually. Let me see if I can... Sorry about that. let me see if I can pull up a quick map for you when it comes to quick map, trench map. So there were new tactics that were necessary, and it was actually the Germans, out of everyone, that ended up coming up with new tactics that became detrimental. Actually, I don't need to pull it up there. There we go. And this new tactic was called the Stormtrooper. Now, you're probably familiar with this term because of something like Star Wars, right? But this is where the Stormtrooper originated from. And what they would end up doing is they were highly skilled. Usually they were younger because it was much easier for them, for younger soldiers to cover the ground that was necessary than older troops. They were faster. They were lighter on their feet. They had much more energy. So what stormtroopers would do is they would lead the charge. So they would have key selected areas. They were armed with rifles, carbines actually, because they were smaller, grenades, and actually grenades was one of their primary weapons. So they would actually lead the charge in specific areas against the enemy. And their job was to come in and muck up as much shit as possible. Just try and create a breakthrough in the enemy lines. It didn't have to be consistently all the way through. But create these holes. And then from there, they would move farther into enemy territory, continuing their process. It was actually very dangerous to be a German stormtrooper, but there was a lot of respect that came with them. So this would be the initial wave of attack that ended up coming out of the German soldiers. And when they had broken through, the rest of the German army would then attack. Like this. And so they would already have openings in the lines, and if some German soldiers came across where they wouldn't, then they would try and break through their normal way. But having these breaks in the enemy armament gave the German soldiers where they needed, because as you can see, these sort of red squiggles represents where the breakthrough would happen. So this would allow the German soldiers that were falling behind the stormtroopers to sort of go in either way and flank their enemy inside the trenches. And this is what made the Germans so effective for such a long time. Now, the other advantage is because the Germans were the invading army. They were invading Belgium, they were invading France. Since they were the invading army, they didn't actually have to capture territory. They could just, now that they were inside of France and Belgium, they were comfortable. It was the Allied troops that had to drive the Germans out of their territory. So the Germans could just sit down, bunker down, and work on refining their trenches, which they ended up doing. In fact, the Germans were smarter about this because they dug deeper trenches with more intricate armaments and protection, and they also had set up for the long run. Some of their trenches even had electricity. This was completely opposite to what the Allies had to deal with, especially when we're talking about the British soldiers, because the British commanders didn't want their troops to feel too at home in their trenches. So they actually opted for much less comfortable trenches than the Germans did. The Germans knew they were in for the long run, so they built for the long run. But the British wanted to force them out and wanted to make their soldiers feel this way. So because of it, they dug shallower trenches. They didn't build wasn't built for comfortability. So this is why a lot of the pictures that you see of the horrible conditions that a lot of these soldiers suffered through came from the Allied side over the German side. There were things that the Germans took into consideration. One of the big problems during World War I was known as trench foot. And what this is because it rained a lot in this area, especially during the summer times. So one of the problems is that your trench would fill up with water. Now, most of the time, it wasn't so bad that you'd end up drowning, but this did happen from time to time to some soldiers. The real problem you'd be standing all day and all night with your feet in water. Now, you know what happens when you stand in water for too long. Your feet and your skin gets all pruny and it gets really soft. Well, what ended up happening is because of such long durations inside of the trenches, the skin would start to fall off the bone of the soldiers because that's what happens after a long period of time. So they developed things that was called trench foot, and there's also along with trench foot came things such as diseases. So this was a problem, but it was a much bigger problem on the Allied side because they didn't build their trenches to withstand. So they didn't really work on much of a drain when it came to drainage. Where at least the Germans were much more prepared for that. They had built in a drainage system for the water, and they also built up elevated positions. So above the foot of the trench, which would be dirt, you might see in the old movies where they had just pieces of wood that would be laid down on the ground to give them a little bit of elevation. But the Germans actually used wood to build platforms. So that way the water would run down into the trenches below them, but the German soldiers wouldn't have to worry so much about actually standing all day and all night in water. So because of this reason, the Allied forces suffered a lot more than the Germans did when it came to casualties, when it came to suffering at the hands of diseases. They were really ill prepared for the whole situation. But what was important when it came to World War I was the war of attrition, because this was what it was all about. See, the British soldiers, and even the German soldiers too, that ended up marching off the war in 1914, these were actually very experienced soldiers because they were part of their standing army. They had been trained. They had fought before. So this was a much normal thing. And even the British soldiers had fought in things such as I think it was the Franco-Japanese War, possibly. I think that's what it was called. Anyway, the British soldiers were well trained. But the war was, especially in 1914, because they didn't have the battlements prepared, this actually meant that there were so many casualties that almost every single year, both sides, the British, the French, the Germans, would have to build up a new standing army. Now, this became progressively harder year and year because people were hearing about the atrocities of the war. People were starting to see how many soldiers were coming home dead if they came home at all. So, because of this, it became so much harder every single year. But it was important to build up these forces because both sides was aware that the side that was going to win the war was the side that could field the last army. And this is what made the Americans' entrance into the war near the end of the war so important. The Americans barely took to the field in World War I. But just the fact that they were coming was enough because Germany was exhausted from the war. By the time 1918 rolled around, they were hiring straight out of high school. Some of these kids hadn't even finished school, and they were going off to war. So they were ill-prepared for the situation that was at hand. They couldn't field nearly as many soldiers as they could at the beginning of the war, and neither could the British or French. But with the Americans coming in with fresh troops, this meant that there was nothing that they could do because you don't really have an army that can span the length of the trenches. Because if we take a look at our map right here, you could have, at the beginning, soldiers all spanning the trenches themselves. There were 3 lines. So you could have them covering a lot of it. Went a little crazy with that final line. So on both sides, you could have this, which made it very difficult to break through because there would be so many different soldiers that were there. But as the war progressed and became a lot more difficult, suddenly they had less people on the front lines, just like this. So there were all these gaps, all these openings inside their lines, which just made it easier for the enemy to slip past and then flank them. So if this is what the situation you're facing, and the Germans can no longer field the appropriate amount to span such a length of the trenches themselves, while on the other side, the Americans are coming, which means that they can take up all the positions that are being being left open by exhausted British and French troops, then you're just at a disadvantage. So this is the real reason that we ended up winning the war, that the Allies ended up winning the war, was simply because with fresh troops coming in, it was a war of attrition. Germany could no longer stand up to it. So that's when the armistice ended up happening. And it wasn't actually signed till 1919, about a year after the war ended up going on. This is when the final actual treaties was worked out, the Treaty of Versailles. But by 1918, on the 11th of November, 1918, it was official that the war was over at 11 a.m. So this is the sort of things that the Allied troops had to deal with. And this is why we celebrate Remembrance Day, because we saw a lot of troops ended up going to the wayside during this. They ended up being slaughtered. This is from every single country that ended up fielding soldiers. They saw massive losses. Plenty of people that were going to do their duty overseas didn't come back. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians, millions of British and French never returned home. Millions of Germans never returned home. So it's very important that we celebrate these soldiers because they've given a lot to us. And on top of that, they suffer from mental illnesses because of what they've seen. And this continues on today. At the time during the First World War, it was known as shell shock because if you were sitting in the underground bunkers in the trenches, one of the strategies was with the artillery was you would bombard them. And now the bombardment, as I already explained, was to destroy the trenches and the defenses. But on top of that, it was a psychological warfare because you usually would bombard them for couple days, maybe 3 days before you actually went in for a massive attack against the enemy. So during the course of these 2 or 3 days, all these people are hearing are loud explosions over their head. They can't get any real sleep because it's too loud. And they're already nervous. They know an attack is coming. So people's nervous systems, they would be stretched until they finally snapped. And this is where PTSD originally came from, although the term changed over time. It was shell shock here. I believe it was known by World War II as something along the lines of operational exhaustion. And then before eventually became its final form, post-traumatic stress disorder. But I have a problem with the term PTSD because for the main reason that it's something like shell shock hits you hard. It has a real meaning behind it. You can almost, when you use the term shell shock, you can almost hear the explosions that probably these people would have suffered. Post-traumatic stress disorder has just sucked a lot of the humanity out of the term itself, and it's just thrown around so easily. This is some of my problems too when I hear people say like, Trump gave some Americans PTSD in 2016. This is actually just a new report that's come out. And it's just because it is hugely different between a person that you hate and being in a war such as what I've just described to you. And even a wars of today. So this is my problem that I have with everybody when they use terms such as PTSD. So just disregarding what the meaning behind it is, and the people who suffer from these. They have real reasons that they suffer. Now, as we get into the modern day Remembrance Day, it appears that our brave leader will be spending the day, Remembrance Day, in France. So as this says here, as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announces he would skip out on Remembrance Day services for the second straight year, we learned that over 270,000 Canadian veterans have been shortchanged on their pension and disability benefits. That's what we're going to be getting into in just a little bit. Now, this is a difficult position. I actually will admit that this is a bit of a difficult position for Justin Trudeau. Now, I personally disagree that he should be over in France, that he should be home. But this is the 100th anniversary of the ending of the war. So there's actually reasons for world leaders to descend on France during this time. Now, again, he should be here. He should be here in Canada standing up for our veterans, because the Trudeau government has consistently fought our veterans on their rights. Now, this is something that has been going on for years now. It can't just be strictly Justin Trudeau who has done this. But with telling veterans that they're asking for too much, for spending millions of dollars fighting veterans in court to not give them the access to care that they require, that they deserve, that they've earned for going to fight, and even if they didn't fight, for standing up and defending our country. I mean, if an attack came tomorrow, these will be the first people rushing into the battle. That deserves something. That deserves some respect. But this is something that's been going on for some time now, as this report is coming out right here, which I have big problems with some of the things, the terminology that they use in here. But the title of it from CBC News is "Veterans Shortchanged $165 million in Pensions and Disability Payments." So let's take a listen to what they have to say on this.
Veterans have been shortchanged.
My mistake. I thought I had that playing. I thought I apparently had the volume for this muted. So let's try that again.
Less than a week before we honor those who've served Canada in military conflicts around the world, CBC News has learned that more than 250,000 veterans have been shortchanged in their disability pensions by at least $165 million. The CBC's Murray Brewster has been looking into this story and has the details. So, Murray, how did this happen?
Well, the mistake was uncovered by the Veterans Ombudsman's Office, and it ran from 2002 until about 2010. It affected both the disability award payment, but also disability pensions. Now, what's intriguing about this is that we have 272,000 veterans who were affected by this. Most of them are elderly war service veterans, such as the Second World War or Korea. Many of them have passed away since that time and since the error was made, about 175,000 out of the 272,000. What's intriguing about this, though, is that the error appears to have been discovered by Veterans Affairs in 2011, and the correct calculation for the disability benefits was made going forward. But there appears to have been no attempt to go back and compensate veterans for the lost income that they suffered between 2002 and 2010.
So how is Ottawa making up this shortfall to these veterans?
Well, now that it's been pointed out by the Veterans Ombudsman, the Veterans Affairs Department has acknowledged it, and the minister just put out a statement recently and said that $165 million has been appropriated for the purpose of compensating veterans. It's going to be a complicated process, though, Andrew, because since many of the veterans have died, the federal government is going to have to settle with their estates. Now, we're talking about figures ranging anywhere from $50 to perhaps $2,000 for some veterans. And it's going to be a complicated process that the minister says won't begin until 2020.
Murray, thank you. The CBC's Murray Brewster, live in Ottawa.
Okay, so as you can see there, a couple problems I had on that. My first problem that I ended up having is the fact that time and time again, the guy Rory Brewster ended up saying that this was a mistake. It was a mistake. No, that's not a mistake. That is the government deliberately not giving back to the veterans what they have deserved. $165 million is a lot of money, and that cut will cover a lot of veterans. And again, he's talked about how many of these veterans were from World War II and from the Korean War. Now, let's focus on World War II for this one, because World War II, in many ways, was worse than World War I. It was more devastating to Europe as a whole. It was devastating on the people who fought in World War II. So these are people who definitely would suffer from shell shock. They would suffer from all sorts of injuries, whether that's being shot, having limbs blown off, and maybe being gassed, maybe being set on fire. These are countless reasons why we should have been giving this money to these veterans, but they were not receiving this money. And this has been, it said, from 2002. So we're talking about the Jean Chrétien government, the Paul Martin government, the Harper government, and now the Trudeau government. That is 4 different governments that over the course of this time has been screwing over our veterans. Now, I do think that Harper was better when it came to our veterans, but as we can see from this, he really dropped the ball. He dropped the ball time and time again. And this is something that needs to stop. This is something that needs to stop because it's just, these people deserve our support for what they've been through, especially when we're talking about World War II vets and what they've been through. Doesn't matter whether they were in the Navy, the Army, or the Air Force. Especially when we're talking World War II, they saw enough shit, and they should have been compensated by their government for their injuries and everything that they suffered. A piece of your humanity gets left behind on the battlefield, and this seems pretty consistent for most soldiers. Some it affects them worse, but you have to give up a piece of yourself, a piece of your humanity when you go off to war. Sometimes you give that up willingly, sometimes it's stolen from you while you're there. But either way, we have not done enough. Our government has not done enough for the people. And we just are still seeing how even to today, Justin Trudeau is fighting them. So we have here, Trudeau government achieves $500 million in savings by targeting veterans' pensions. This is from November 7th, 2018. It seems the Trudeau government is willing to balance the budget off the backs of those who have already lost so much. When Justin Trudeau introduced the Liberals' much-touted Pension for Life plan of veterans, they promised that it would lead to an increase of $3.6 billion in additional funding for Canadian veterans. A new report by the Globe and Mail interestingly shows that the Liberals have failed this key campaign promise by creating a pension system which would result in almost $500 million less being spent on veterans over the next 5 years. Here's what the report by the Globe and Mail said. When the pensions were unveiled 4 days before Christmas last year, the government said they represent an additional investment of close to $3.6 billion to support Canadian veterans. And on January 31st, Seamus O'Regan, the Minister of Veteran Affairs, told the House of Commons, with our recent announcement of a pension for life, this government total investment in veterans in 2.5 years is $10 billion, a figure that includes the $3.6 billion for the pensions. But the additional money for Pensions for Life, which comes into effect in April 2019, will not be spent anytime soon. In fact, the government predicts its most recent budget it will save $84 million in the next fiscal year and more than $100 million in each of the 4 years as a result of the pension program. The savings are emphasized in accompanying regulations which were published in August. So the Trudeau government has been worse on their spending. They promised us about $9 billion in deficits for the first 3 years to balance the budget in their final year in office. Now, that is clearly not going to be the case. We can see that because a number of reports are coming out that's saying that now the budget won't be balanced until 2050 due to Trudeau's spending. And on top of that, he almost consistently every year is more than doubling the amount of debt that he's bringing in. It's been $18 billion this year. And that doesn't even account for the amount of debt that is coming. That's the federal debt. But we also see how between other Liberal governments, provincial Liberal governments, they're also doing even worse than that. We just found out that Kathleen Wynne government in Ontario was hiding about an extra. They were saying that the debt was going to be some $7 billion, and it turns out it's going to be $15 billion now. So because of this, he's doing everything he can to try and save face, but by doing this, he's stealing from our veterans. That is a scummy thing to do, an absolute scummy thing to do. Do you remember when earlier this year, a veteran stood up who had lost his leg in Afghanistan, lost his leg due to a roadside bomb? And he said that he felt that Canada was turning its back on him because they were fighting him for the benefits that he deserved. And Trudeau's government said that Trudeau himself, ended up saying that the reason that they're fighting the veterans in court is because they're asking for more than they can give right now. Well, that has not stopped Trudeau from giving away billions of dollars overseas to other governments. This is one that we're seeing right now. I've got 2 graphs for you here. They're each covering the amount of money that's been given away. In the last year, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has provided direct cash aid to the Clinton Foundation, $600 million, Hamas, $351 million, Pakistan, $2 billion, Libya, $1.45 billion, Egypt, $397 million, Mexico, $622 million, Russia, $380 million, Haiti, $1.4 billion, Jordan, $463 million, Kenya, $816 million, Sudan, $870 million, Nigeria, $456 million, Uganda, $451 million, Congo, $359 million, Ethiopia, $981 million, South Africa, $566 million, Senegal, $698 million, Mozambique, $404 million, Zambia, $331 million, Kazakhstan, $304 million, Iraq, $1.08 billion, Tanzania, $554 million. That's absolutely atrocious, the amount of money we're giving away. And then he has the balls to say that our government that our veterans are asking for too much. And let's take a look over some of this list. So Hamas is the Palestinian, is in Palestine. Actually, I believe Hamas is the West Bank, if I'm remembering correctly. No. Gaza, I'm pretty sure, is Hamas. So it says here, a designated terrorist organization. But that's not actually what I'm going to focus on here. What I'm going to focus on is, do you remember not too long ago, Canada got into a spat with Saudi Arabia. Now, I have no fucking love for Saudi Arabia. I think they're a disgusting country. People say that Iran is the single largest funder of terrorism in the world. No, it's Saudi Arabia. Look into it, and it's Saudi Arabia. We're still apparently allied with them in some sort of way, even though it really seems like that's going to the wayside right now. We import their oil, but the point is we got into this fight with Saudi Arabia, and the Palestine authorities ended up siding with Saudi Arabia. And this was just after Trudeau ended up giving $50 million to them. So they turn against us. Mexico, $622 million we gave them. Well, don't forget, I didn't agree with this decision to begin with, but during NAFTA negotiations, Canada said, we're going to stand with Mexico. We're going to stand together. And then Trump and the U.S. ended up focusing on Mexico first because they were getting the raw end of the deal there, which would have given us the time that if we weren't going to stand with Mexico, quote unquote, then we could have actually worked something out, a bilateral agreement with the U.S., and we probably would not have had the trouble that we had now. But no, they decide that they're going to virtue signal, say we stand with Mexico, and they do everything they can to try and botch these negotiations. So, and then Mexico, when they finally did work through the initial part of their agreement, their disagreements with America, they continued negotiating without Canada. And then they did what we should have done. They worked out a bilateral agreement with America for NAFTA, and then when that was done, America turned their sights on Canada. And we were the sole problem to them all of a sudden, which means that we ended up getting the short end of the stick when it came to this new USMCA agreement. Which, personally, I just hate the name of it, too, the USMCA. So, we gave this money to Mexico, does nothing for us. Russia, well, Trudeau was one of the main people that was saying that Russia hacked the U.S. election. He had no problem bringing that up. He still brings it up today in trying to say that we need to strengthen our election laws. Meanwhile, he's actually doing quite the opposite. He's going back to third-party vouching. You don't need an ID in order to vote. And then on top of that, he's going to sign the Compact for Migration in December with the UN, which may actually allow immigrants to our country now the right to vote. That one is still yet to be absolutely confirmed, but that could be one of the dangers of it. So he's gone completely to the wayside when it comes to this. And then we even got another list right here, which I suppose many of the same ones are on this list. But as we can see the amount of money that's been given away. Oh, yes, I didn't focus on it. Pakistan. He gives $2 billion to Pakistan, but why? We have a stronger attachment with India. India is actually part of not the Confederation. Oh, I'm forgetting the name of it right now. The Commonwealth. India is actually part of the Commonwealth. It has a big economy. That's who we should be doing trade agreements with. But what ended up happening with Trudeau in India? He ended up screwing us all over. He signs a deal for $1 billion where they give us $250 million worth of goods, and we give them $750 million worth of goods. So we just lost $500 million on that trade negotiation earlier this year because Trudeau ended up going to India, making a fool of himself, and one of the main problems with it was the fact that Prime Minister Modi just wanted Trudeau to get the deal done and then go enjoy his vacation. But Trudeau said, nope, I'm going to celebrate for the first 5 or 6 days, and then after I'm all done, then I'll come see you. We knew that was a disaster right from the beginning. Not to mention that they brought over a Khalistani terrorist, a guy who was actually thrown in prison because they were going to commit acts of terrorism. So he is just willing to side with any sort of group that does not benefit Canada, and then he's going to throw away any sort of agreements we have with our allies. And you know what? This is actually a pretty good time to might as well get into what was going to be my third and minor story, but this sort of plays into what we're talking about right now. So this tweet was put out by Maxime Bernier. Oops. 1 second. I know you can't see it. There it is. So he ends up putting out this tweet where he says, here is what we get after sending $2.3 billion to this country, and he's talking about Tanzania, a government campaign to hunt down and arrest homosexuals. If the GNM, Globe and Mail, if the Canadian government largesse was partly intended to build support for human rights and democratic values, the strategy seems to have failed. And here's the CBC talking about it. So it says, one of this country's main aid recipients is threatening its LGBT community. Official anti-gay prejudice in Tanzania is causing Canadian officials to reassess this country's relationship with one of Canada's biggest aid recipients. Arrests of gay men in Zanzibar over the weekend and the launch of anti-gay patrols in the former capital Dar es Salaam on Monday are the latest incidents to alarm Canadian diplomats. They've come up this week at high-level meetings involving not only Canadian and Tanzanian officials, but also those of other Western donor nations. Tanzania's homophobic actions are particularly uncomfortable for Canada, which gave Tanzania more than $125 million in direct aid last year, making it Canada's sixth largest aid recipient in the world. Canada co-chairs the Equal Rights Coalition, a group of 40 nations that Canada helped create. The coalition promotes LGBT equality around the world and has roundly condemned some of the practices used in Tanzania, particularly the use of forced anal exams to collect evidence of homosexual behavior, in which Tanzania can lead to a life sentence in prison. And this goes back to what we were just talking about, the amount of money that we give away. We're giving all this money away to other nations instead of looking after our own veterans. We need to stop giving so much money away around the world. Stop all foreign aid around the world. And we need to do this for one of the main reasons is because Canada has been about as successful in spreading human rights around the world through the use of money as the Americans have been trying to spread democracy around the world through war. Whenever America has gone in trying to either spread democracy to a country, it's never worked out for them. Never. Even if it works out for a little bit, it never stays. Iraq is the most recent example of this, where they went in, they took the country, and then they started actually installing democratic elections, which probably, if anything, were rigged by the Americans. They were probably by the CIA in them, which was going to rig it so they can put in a puppet for America in Iraq at the time. Well, puppet for Iraq and puppet for America, but really this would be a puppet for Israel, if we're being fairly honest on this. So this was probably what's going on, but what did that last? even a year? Did we even really get through the one real election and one real government before the whole country just went back to the way it was and fell apart? This is the same thing that Canada is doing. We're constantly giving out money to another country trying to spread human rights, whether it happens to be for the LGBT community, whether it happens to be for women's rights or this around the world, but it's not frickin' working. So we need to stop the foreign aid as it goes this way. We need to stop. We need to put that money back into Canada, focus on our own problems here. We may be a first world country, but it doesn't mean that we're perfect. Yeah, there are plenty of worse places around the world, plenty of worse countries around the world, but this is not the way that this should be done. But this is the way the Trudeau government has been doing it. This is the way that it's been done by countless governments throughout Canada, whether they happen to be conservative or they happen to be liberal. This is what we're doing. Now, I do think that the conservatives do tend to give out less money around the world, but they're still giving out billions of dollars. Still giving out billions of dollars to these countries for one project or another when they shouldn't be doing this. They should leave the money at home, send it to programs that we need it. I don't know, use it to actually try and help the homeless situation. Use it for our veterans. Use it for our infrastructure. But don't give this money away to other foreign nations because they don't deserve it. Just need a quick drink. So this did go off from speaking about our veterans and speaking about Remembrance Day. This tends to happen to me when I start focusing on these issues. It really gets to me after a while. But the importance of Remembrance Day is to honor those who have fought for us, and more specifically, to honor those who have died for us. And the one that I will always remember, the one soldier that always sticks in my mind, is Corporal Nathan Cirillo. He was the one that back in, was it 2014 or 2015? He was the one that was guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier when Parliament was attacked by that crazy fuck Bebo. He was doing his duty. He was doing his duty by standing guard, and it was 2014. I just looked up, so it was 2014. So this is 4 years ago. This guy was doing his duty by standing guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier. This is a ceremonial position. They have guns but are not loaded. And this is when Michael Bebo ended up coming behind him and putting, I believe, 2 rounds into his back. People always said, never forget. And that's why I found it was important. One of our soldiers died for a stupid cause. Because this crazy terrorist fuck just wanted to hurt some people. He was a dog lover too. And I think one of the worst images I ever saw after that was a picture that ended up getting taken. He had 2 dogs. And it came out a couple days after he died. And it was from at his house where somebody got a photo of his 2 dogs sticking their head from underneath their gate. And they just looked so sad. Looked so sad because their owner wasn't coming home. This is the importance of Remembrance Day. So tomorrow, honor them. Alrighty. So, let's focus on our other story that we're going to be discussing today. And then we'll wrap it up. Saskatchewan's changes to trespassing laws target First Nation community, FSIN Vice Chief. The proposed Property Act will promote vigilantism, says Heather Bear. That's Heather Bear right here. And it's for the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. That's what FSIN stands for. So, Saskatchewan's Indigenous community is worried that their government plan to crack down on rural crime by strengthening trespassing laws could stoke racial tension and put First Nation people in danger, especially in the aftermath of the Colton Boushie trial. I'm not quite certain marginalization is part of it, and I really think that this could promote. Oh, I'm quite certain marginalization is part of it, and I really think that this could promote or will promote vigilantism. Heather Bear, Vice Chief of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, told The Current's Anna Maria Tremonti. Look at what's happened in the Boushie case. A young man's life was taken, and of course there was no consequences. The land was more important than a First Nation's life. Now, this isn't actually the problem here. Colton Boushie was on someone else's property against permission. They came in with a group of people. They had a gun. It was clear that a gun was found inside of his car. Now, even if he didn't bring the gun out, that meant that I believe the gun was illegal too. Actually, maybe. I don't know exactly how the laws when it comes to gun ownership affect First Nation people. But anyway, there was a gun that he brought on property. Now, they claim that he had popped his tire on his truck and that he was there trying to get help. But this wasn't the case because the owner of this property, Gerald Stanley, ended up getting attacked. His wife got attacked too, something that they didn't really talk about. The two things they didn't want to talk about in this case when it came to the media was the fact that there was a gun found inside his car and that this guy, Gerald Stanley's wife, was attacked in this process. So was Gerald Stanley himself. They also had a child in their home. So especially for people who consider themselves liberal, if you consider yourself liberal, then you should know one of the key things that was said by John Locke, who is the founder of liberalism. And he says that one of the key principles of liberalism is life, liberty, and the right to private property. Now, the Americans changed this from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but this is where it comes from. This is where this idea comes from. So if you do consider yourself liberal, then you understand you understand the importance of private property and protecting that private property. You don't just get to come on someone else's property and commit criminal acts like this. There's a big difference between this. And they say that that a First Nation, that land is more important than a First Nation's life. That's not the case. The case is a matter of self-defense. Now, as it even states in here, in August 2016, farmer Gerald Stanley fatally shot Boushie, a 22-year-old Indigenous man. Stanley was acquitted of second-degree murder after testifying that his gun went off accidentally. And now they were saying that he either pulled the trigger accidentally, or I believe actually what they were saying was that there was like a misfire from his gun that ended up killing him. Now, I don't actually believe this is true, but you have to show intent that the person was planning to murder him. There's two types of murder: first degree and second degree. Now, first degree murder is premeditated. That's where you plan it, you're going to go out, you're going to do it. Second degree murder is sort of like what took place. An event goes down and you murder someone, and then you have manslaughter, which is you killed someone but you're not directly responsible, but you still have to face your time because of it. He was going on the second degree murder, but I think what really pursued the jury in order to let him go had to do with the fact that the fact that they were seeing that he was defending himself, his family, and his property from somebody that was coming and attacking and even trying to steal stuff from his property. I don't think it was his truck, Gerald Stanley's truck, that ended up getting taken, but it was like one thing that alerted him to it, when I believe it was something like his ATV or something like that, ended up powering on when he was not outside, when he was not using it. None of his family was using it. They were trying to steal from his property. So as it says, under the proposed changes to the Property Act, people will no longer be required to post no trespassing signs on their property. Bear said this violates First Nation treaty rights by reducing the land that can be accessed for hunters and medicine gatherers. We agreed to share the land, Bear told Tremonti. We never gave up all our land, and that's why we have rights. Those are real. That's a real, true covenant. Yes, that's true, but there is the land that's specified out. Now, you can't actually just come in and claim private property rights onside an indigenous reserve, because that is considered indigenous rights. And Gerald Stanley was not an indigenous man. So which means, I'm pretty sure that this means that his private property was not on indigenous lands. And that also doesn't mean that the indigenous people can't just come onto private property because of it. I mean, from the sound of it, it sounds like this woman, Bear, wants to. It sounds like she wants to allow any indigenous person access to any part of private property, on anyone's private property. What if they go in someone's house, but they considered that? Would that not be considered a violation? But anyway, we saw what Justin Trudeau ended up having to say, and what many people were saying about this situation when it came to the actual ruling itself. So this is what Trudeau ended up having to say on it.
First of all, I know I speak on behalf of millions of Canadians when I say that our hearts go out to Colton Boushie's family, his mom Debbie, his friends, and the entire community. I'm not going to comment on the process that led us to this point today, but I am going to say we have come to this point as a country far too many times. Indigenous people across this country are angry, they're heartbroken, and I know Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians alike know that we have to do better.
So that's what Trudeau ended up saying on the matter, and he actually went even farther than that. He ended up going as far as pretty much suggesting that the ruling was wrong. Now, this is a dangerous precedent in order to set. It's a very dangerous precedent in order to set. See, here's the thing about the Canadian system. In comparison to the American system is based on separation of powers. This is why the president does not vote in Congress. They can go speak to Congress, but they don't have a say in what goes on inside of Congress. Same with the Senate. They have Congress and the Senate. They've got the which makes up their legislative body. They have the president, which makes up their executive body, and then they have the courts, which makes up their judicial body. Now, what separates this from Canada is the fact that we actually, between the legislative and executive branch, have what's called a fusion of power. It brings both the authority of the executive and legislative branch together. And right now, what's going on with Justin Trudeau is a perfect example of this. See, you end up voting in for the party. Actually, just before I say that, it just shows a little bit of the separation, too, when it comes to the American system. The American side, they vote on their Congress, they vote on their senators, and they vote on their president. We don't do that. We vote on Parliament. That's it. I mean, we're talking on the federal level, excluding provincially. But you don't vote on your senators. And you also actually don't vote on your prime minister. See, you vote for the party. That's why whenever you go to the polls, you won't find, do you want Justin Trudeau, Andrew Scheer, Jagmeet Singh, or Elizabeth May? This is why you don't see that. But you will see your MP for your local riding. It's because you're voting for the party. And then what ends up happening is that when the party gets in, whoever is the leader of that party becomes the Prime Minister of Canada. See, it's actually pretty, I'll say that use the term easy. Maybe that's not an appropriate word to use, but it's actually pretty easy to remove the Prime Minister from office. All that has to do is the party itself has to have an interior vote on who the leader is. So if they become disillusioned with Justin Trudeau and they want a new leader, they can vote Justin Trudeau out as the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, and then whoever they vote in as the new leader becomes the new Prime Minister of Canada. It's actually much more harder to get the party out of control, because you really can only do that through if the election hasn't come up yet, then you can only do it through a vote of no confidence, and you have to have a majority in Parliament in order to pass a vote of no confidence. So let's take the situation with Justin Trudeau. He's the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Him and his cabinet make up the executive branch of Canada. And the Liberal Party makes up the legislative body of government. Now that is shared that is shared with the other parties. That's shared with Conservatives, shared with NDP, that's shared with the Greens. But when you have a situation like this, where you have the Prime Minister and the Cabinet sitting inside of Parliament who are helping to vote on what's going on, and you have a majority government, like the Liberals do now, which means they don't need to make any concessions with any other party. Whatever they decide, as long as all the members of the government, of the party, vote for it, all the MPs of the party, they can pass whatever laws they want. There's nothing that can be done by the other parties except criticize it. So you have a fusion of power there between the executive and legislative branch. Now, Justin Trudeau was trying to manipulate the judicial branch. You know what the description of a tyrant is? Someone who has control over the executive, legislative, and judicial bodies of a government. Total control. So if he manipulates the judicial system into what he wants, then he has that control over all three branches of government, and he is, by every definition of the word, a dictator. This is why it was so dangerous with the words that he was using, because he is one step away from having that control to become a tyrant. And then he can do whatever the hell he wants, because if he has control of the courts, you can't go and sue the government now, because they'll rule in favor of the government. You see the danger that we have there, which is why it's ironic when people call Trump a dictator, because Trump only has executive power. He does not have power of the legislation. He does not have power of the courts. And this is the other thing, too, is we don't vote on our senators like the Americans do. This is appointed. They are appointed by the government that's in charge, and they're appointed for life. Where at least when it comes to the U.S. system, their senators have a 6-year term. Every 6 years, they're back up for election. So this was the dangers of the Colton Boushie case and what was really bad about what Justin Trudeau ended up saying about it. And of course, many of the press were then starting to play this victim game too, very similar to what they did with what's his name? Brown, the guy who had the hands up, don't shoot guy from America. Anyway, I'm sure by now everyone knows what I'm saying when I'm talking about that. I want to say Patrick Brown, but he's the old leader of the PC party of Ontario. Anyway, so it's very similar to that, where they were painting him as the victim, despite the fact he actually was the aggressor in that situation. And so was Colton Boushie. It shouldn't matter whether the man is Indigenous or not, but people are up in arms simply because he was Indigenous. And then the big criticism is that an all-white jury acquitted Gerald Stanley from the crime. And since then, the Liberals have been trying... Liberals set to reform jury selection process after Boushie case, March 29th, 2018. So now they are manipulating the court system for this through legislation. Oh, this just keeps getting better and better. The federal government has introduced legislation aimed at overhauling the criminal justice system, a measure that makes good on Liberal promise to change the way juries are selected. A number of visible Indigenous people were excluded from the jury last month, acquitted Saskatchewan farmer Gerald Stanley, 56, in the shooting death of Colton Boushie, 22, a member of the Red Pheasant First Nation. Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould tabled a massive bill Thursday that, if passed, would eliminate the use of peremptory challenges, which allow lawyers to reject jury candidates during the selection process. This is a terrible thing to table, because the reason that allows the lawyers to reject jury candidates from the selection process is simply because it allows them that if there is somebody who has a bias or is not going to be impartial in the case, then allows them to eject them. Now, this has to be from both sides, because if you're just going to be in favor of the prosecution, and you can already tell this sort of thing, then the defense needs to be able to say, hey, no, we're refusing this person. And actually, it has to be decided on by both the prosecution and the defense. The jury selection is agreed by both. So this is what actually helps make our system fairer. That doesn't mean it's perfect, but if both the prosecution and the defense have to agree on who is in the jury, then this actually is the best process that we can come up with. And then it goes on to say the bill includes other measures aimed at tackling court backlog plaguing the criminal justice system, including by restricting the use of preliminary inquiries to cases where the offender is facing the possibility of life sentences, such as for murder, kidnapping, or aggravated sexual assault. I think that's all I had for this when it came to it. The Ontario government had advocated limiting preliminary inquiries to an even more limited number of cases, murder and treason, but Attorney General Yasir Naqvi said he is pleased with how far the federal changes go. This is literally putting social justice ahead of our court system. That's a scary point of view. But hold on, I didn't mean to get to that yet. But this is actually pretty telling of the whole situation and why this idea of being able, these preliminaries here, these preliminary decisions are actually important. Because this case, this ended up coming out on February 13th, 2018, which said half of prospective Bushi jurors were Aboriginal, says member of a jury pool. And it goes on to say, almost half the prospective jurors in the Colton Bushi case were Aboriginal persons, according to one member of the jury pool. However, the reason there was no Aboriginal Canadians on the jury in these controversial case is because so many deliberately opted out of the process. Other First Nation prospective jurors, meanwhile, were openly and outwardly biased during the selection process, according to one prospective juror who spoke to The Sun. The witness, who The Sun is choosing not to identify, was present for the jury selection in the Bushi case. The person described the scene as a large gymnasium turned into a courtroom in Battleford, Saskatchewan. Media reports state that 700 people received jury duty notice for the case, and of that, only about 200 showed up that Monday morning. Quote, I sat at the back and got a better idea of who was all there, said the prospective juror. On one side of the room, it was primarily Caucasian people, a few Filipinos, a couple black people, and peppered in was a handful of First Nation people. On the other side of the room, it was maybe 3/4 First Nations people, the person said, estimating that approximately 85 to 100 of the initial 200 prospective jurors were Aboriginal. So about half of the jurors were Aboriginal. And now they're trying to claim that it was unfair because there were no Aboriginal people on the actual jury itself. Well, let's go in. According to the prospective juror, who did not go on to serve for the jury, a significant number of Aboriginal people in the room asked to be disqualified either because they had relation with Colton Bushi's family or because other circumstances that made them unavailable. So they even said that they had relationship with Colton Bushi's family, which is another reason why you need to have this process where you can eliminate jurors. Because what happens if one of these people got on who had a relationship with Colton Bushi's family? They obviously would have a bias in it, which is why it's important to eliminate these sort of people. You need to have people that are unbiased and who will listen to the facts. We're all humans. We're going to have our biases. So that's why it's actually important to have the less people that are familiar with the case, the better. The person estimates that more than half of the Aboriginal people were granted permission by the judge to be exempted of the trial and free to go home. As the prospective juror described, some of the remaining 45 or so were vocal in expressing their biases and signaling to everyone in the room that they were unfit to serve the jury. Quote, you could audibly hear some of them talking amongst themselves, discussing how they were going to hang Stanley, or they were going to make sure he gets hung, or that if they don't get the results they want, that they are going to handle it themselves, the person said on the Aboriginal people who remained. This account comes from one individual who spoke to The Sun and is not yet corroborated by other witnesses. The thing is that most shocking to me is the fact that they were so audible from where I was sitting across the room, and there were police scattered throughout the room. No one stopped them. Now, I think the main reason that they wouldn't get stopped is for this very reason, that they have to be eliminated from the jury itself, rather than just stopped by the police themselves. The police, I'm pretty sure, are just there to make sure that everything goes, maintain order, make sure nothing bad happens. But as we can see from this person's, what he said on the matter, he says that they were going to hang Stanley, were going to make sure he gets hung, or handle it themselves if they didn't get the court ruling that they liked. If these people had been on the jury, this would not be a fair trial for Stanley. This is what our society is built on, the right to a fair trial. But this is not what was ended up happening because of it. We were having that. Instead, we were hearing that how biased they were and going to extreme examples such as this. So this is why you can't put social justice ahead of the actual democratic process, of the judicial process, because it's dangerous. And this is exactly how it's dangerous. And if Trudeau cares so much about our process, why doesn't he appoint more judges? Because we have a vacancy of judges right now, and this is why it's slowing things down in our court system. Trudeau government sets new record for vacant appointments. From judges to board members, hundreds of positions waiting to be filled. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government has set a new record for the number of unfilled government appointments, with 594 jobs currently vacant or occupied by someone whose appointment is past its expiry date, according to an analysis by CBC News. A year after the Liberals assured Canadians their new open, merit-based appointment system was in place and could fix the problem, the government's ability to make appointments is still plagued by backlogs and bureaucracy. Now, here's the thing. Merit-based systems and social justice don't go together. They never have, they never will, because you can't favor one group of people over another and then say it's a merit-based system. So people should have been aware of this right from the get-go. And this is also from December 1st, 2017, so about a year ago. But this has been the problem. So he's not appointing judges that actually help with the backlog right now, not appointing people inside the judicial system that would help with the backlog, and even when it comes to by-elections, he has called about 1 out of every 4 vacant seats when it comes to MPs. He has only called those by-elections. 1 in 4. He's done a terrible job at filling appointments, but as long as people he agrees with, he has no problem there, because the Trudeau government appointed former Omar Khadr's lawyer as a federal judge February 27, 2018. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberal government has appointed one of Omar Khadr's former lawyers as a justice in federal court. The appointment of Toronto-based lawyer John Norris was announced by Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould Monday. Elizabeth Walker, a lawyer and chairperson for the RCMP External Review Committee, was also appointed to the position. So don't forget that this lawyer Justin Trudeau was more than happy to pay out the $10.5 million to the Omar Khadr, and he said he was doing it because, we will have lost so much more and it was pointless to fight the case anyway. So he's going to do that, but he's going to fight our veterans in court. Most of our problems right now in modern day, when it comes to the judicial system, can actually be traced back to Justin Trudeau, in that the way that merit-based juries are going out the window, in the way that why we have such a backlog over the last 3 years. We've had a backlog for a lot longer, but he is to blame for this because he's not appointing the appropriate people. And now he's trying to change the rules when it comes to selecting juries to get more in line with what he wants, what he believes. Not a merit-based system, not one that's fair or impartial, but one that is filled with social justice. How disgusting is that? I think that's all I have for everyone today. I want to thank you for tuning in to the True North Report. I hope you learned something here today, and I'll be back soon with the stories that are important to Canadians. Talk to you soon.